Well, if you're here, there's a good chance that you've watched my spoiler-free review of The Last of Us Part 2, and if not, I highly recommend you do so before continuing with this video. That video can be found here and features discussions on the game's broad themes, writing, presentation, and gameplay mechanics, and overall I thought the game was excellent. Not perfect, but still very well put together. But there are some elements of the game that are worth talking about in the context of a review that might be considered spoilers, and that's why I'm here with my own Part 2. So let's start with the big one, the role of Abby. The beginning of the game introduces Abby, portrayed by Laura Bailey, as leader of the group whose actions cause Ellie to leave Jackson on a mission of vengeance. In short, she's framed as the antagonist. On its own, this wouldn't be particularly interesting, but at around the halfway point of The Last of Us Part 2, your perspective shifts as you relive the past few days of Ellie's journey from Abby's point of view. The actual surprise element of controlling the antagonist doesn't wind up being all that surprising, since the game puts you in control of her before her role in the story is made crystal clear, but I think it accomplishes a couple of interesting things. Experiencing the consequences of Ellie's vengeance from the opposite side does help to humanize her targets a lot, and it's where the game toys with what I would consider to be its most interesting theme, that of perspective, and specifically how different perspectives can result in two entirely different but no less valid truths. Of all the themes that The Last of Us Part 2 deals with, this is the one that feels the most unique, if not the most important. But I don't think that's the only thing that Abby's story accomplishes. The second half of the game is also home to the most consistently solid writing, as it focuses less on the search for vengeance and instead on the rediscovery of one's own humanity. It's still dark, don't get me wrong, but there's at least some light at the end of this tunnel. Abby's turn from the top killer in her military organization to someone who empathizes with outcasts from a rival faction is my favorite aspect of The Last of Us Part 2's story, and makes for the most satisfying character arc in the entire game. Abby also serves as a compelling foil to Ellie, with elements of her backstory and her fixation on revenge mirroring the game's quote-unquote protagonist, while aspects of her journey contrast pretty sharply with that of Ellie's. While we're talking about aspects of Abby's story, I also think that The Last of Us Part 2 does a solid job of featuring a diverse cast of characters. I thought it was great that it features multiple main characters of different sexual identities, and though pre-release rumors from whiny internet babies labeling Abby as trans turned out to be false, it turns out there is some trans representation among the cast, in the form of the Seraphite outcast Lev. Lev is a genuinely interesting character, given his time in a technology-shunning religious group and how his identity conflicts with that background, and his growing friendship with Abby was actually pretty heartwarming at times. Now, I'm a cisgender male, so that's kind of where my opinion on the matter ends. Representation is rad. People of the minority groups being represented will no doubt have a variety of takes on this, and they'll be more nuanced and illuminating than mine, for sure. To that end, I think it's worth noting that Lev's gender identity is inextricably linked to his story, highlighted by members of his former religious group dead-naming him almost immediately. And despite that particular act being framed in a negative light, no matter how believable this response might be in this world and context provided, there's a good chance that it could be pretty confronting for some audiences, especially since there are no warnings regarding these elements beforehand. Beyond The Last of Us Part 2's narrative elements, Abby's section of the game isn't so different from Ellie's, but there are some notable tweaks. For starters, you have an entirely different assortment of weapons and upgrade trees available to you, and while they cover a lot of the same ground as Ellie's options, there are some neat exceptions. In particular, I found the flamethrower and semi-automatic rifle really satisfying to use. Additionally, Abby has different crafting options with pipe bombs rather than Molotovs, and the reintroduction of shivs. Clickers still get to be super scary as long as you're playing as Abby. Thankfully though, these shivs don't play double duty as lockpicks as well, so I'm ultimately fine with Abby's options feeling a little more in line with the previous game's gameplay. In a broader sense though, I feel like playing as Abby has a slightly different tone. Her weapon options and the frequency of set-piece sequences that take place during her half of the game give it a more action-oriented flavor. That's not to say there aren't moments of subdued, creepy horror, as I'd say Abby experiences one of the most tense parts of the game, but it does feel like there's a subtle shift in focus. Ultimately, I don't think the decision to have you play as the so-called antagonist is a bad choice. Quite the opposite, in fact. Experiencing the story from two points of view is something that most games don't opt for, and I think it accomplishes exactly what it sets out to do. Though the idea is sure to frustrate some players with a strong attachment to the first Last of Us. What I do think is that the inclusion of Abby's perspective does leave the game feeling a little bloated, and it's hard to deny that The Last of Us Part 2 buckles under its story a bit. As I said in my main review, the game is something like 25 hours long and features multiple points where the game could have reached a satisfying conclusion, and while I can't think of any elements that don't feel worthwhile, the game's epilogue could probably be its own thing. It already feels like a mini Part 3, and the thought of splitting The Last of Us Part 2 into two games and expanding on that epilogue could potentially leave the game feeling more evenly paced. With that said though, I think my time with The Last of Us Part 2 was well spent despite its length, and I hope that anyone who listens to this and gets the game to try for themselves enjoys it even half as much as I did. Thank you so much for checking out this special addendum to my review of The Last of Us Part 2. Now after plowing through that in a weekend and writing this, I need to sleep. Badly. See you all next time.